Being too competitive, I think, sometimes is a bad thing.
Johnny Carson was one of the most powerful and private men in television history. For 30 years, he welcomed America into his studio every night. When he died, many assumed his massive fortune would be divided among family, friends, and the people who had been close to him for decades. But that's not what happened. The way Carson handled his estate shocked even those who thought they understood him. Join us as we uncover the surprising story behind Johnny Carson's final decision and the person he chose above everyone else. The boy who learned to control the room. Johnny Carson was born in Norfolk, Nebraska in 1925, right in the middle of the Great Depression. His childhood was quiet and simple, shaped by small-town values and limited distractions. Life in Norfolk moved slowly, and people tended to mind their own business. Carson grew up in a modest household, where entertainment was something you created for yourself, not something that came easily. This environment played a major role in shaping who he became. From a young age, Carson was shy and reserved. He wasn't the loudest kid in the room, and he didn't naturally seek attention in social settings. Instead, he observed people closely. He watched how others talked, joked, and reacted. This habit of watching, rather than speaking, stayed with him for life. It helped him understand timing, behavior, and what made people laugh or stay quiet. One thing did break through his shyness early on: magic. When Carson was a boy, he received a magic kit, and it changed everything. Practicing tricks gave him a sense of control he didn't feel in everyday life. When he performed magic, people focused on him. They listened, they reacted. For the first time, Carson experienced the feeling of holding a room's attention, and he liked it. Magic became more than a hobby. It became a safe way for him to connect with others without opening up emotionally. These early performances helped shape his personality. Carson learned that he could express himself best through performance, rather than conversation. He didn't need to explain how he felt if he could make people laugh or surprise them. This preference stayed with him into adulthood. He was often more comfortable on stage than in close personal relationships, where emotional openness was expected. During World War II, Carson served in the United States Navy. Military life introduced him to structure, discipline, and routine. It also gave him new audiences. While stationed at sea, Carson entertained fellow sailors with jokes, impressions, and magic tricks. These informal performances helped him sharpen his timing and confidence. He learned how to read a crowd quickly and adjust based on their reactions, a skill that later became central to his success. After the war, Carson returned to civilian life with a clear sense of direction. He tried college and considered traditional career paths, but none of them felt right. The idea of settling into a normal routine didn't appeal to him. He had already experienced the power of an audience, and he wanted more of it. Performing wasn't just something he enjoyed, it felt necessary. Carson knew that his future wouldn't be quiet or ordinary, and he was ready to chase something bigger. And this hunger for attention would soon push him out of small rooms and toward a much larger stage. King of late-night TV. After returning from the Navy, Johnny Carson didn't walk straight into fame. His career started slowly, and at times, painfully. He took a job at WOW-TV in Omaha, where local television was rough and unpredictable. Budgets were small, crews were tiny, and hosts were expected to do everything. Carson wrote jokes, performed skits, introduced guests, and filled time however he could. Nothing was polished, and mistakes happened often. This period forced Carson to work non-stop. He learned how to think quickly and stay calm on live television. There were no second takes. If something went wrong, he had to fix it on the spot. While the audience was small, the experience was valuable. Carson was building skills without realizing how important they would later become. He also learned patience. Success did not come quickly, and he had to accept years of quiet effort with little recognition. His first real break came when he moved to Los Angeles and landed a role on the game show Who Do You Trust? The show paired him with announcer Ed McMahon, a partnership that would later become famous. The show gave Carson his first national exposure. Viewers across the country began to recognize his face and dry humor. He wasn't loud or flashy, but his calm delivery stood out. While Who Do You Trust wasn't a massive hit, it proved Carson could handle national television. More importantly, network executives began to see him as reliable. He showed up prepared, stayed professional, and didn't cause trouble. That reputation mattered in an industry full of strong personalities and fragile egos. In 1962, Carson was given the opportunity that would change his life. He was selected to take over The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, replacing Jack Paar. Paar had been emotional and unpredictable, and the show was popular but unstable. Carson walked into a role that came with pressure and high expectations. Many people were unsure if he was the right choice. Carson's early months on The Tonight Show were uncomfortable. He appeared stiff, nervous, and unsure of himself. His jokes didn't always land, and his delivery felt cautious. Critics questioned whether he could handle the format, but Carson didn't panic. Instead, he studied the show closely. He adjusted small things night after night, learning what worked and what didn't. Over time, Carson shaped the show into something that fit him. He settled into the monologue, developed a relaxed way of talking to the audience, and used the desk as a place of control rather than distance. The couch became a space for conversation, not performance. The band helped set the pace of the show, and Carson learned how to move smoothly from jokes to interviews to music. Nothing felt rushed or forced. As the years passed, The Tonight Show became a nightly routine for millions of Americans. Carson wasn't just a host, he became a familiar presence in people's homes. Watching him before bed became a habit. His reactions mattered as much as his jokes. A raised eyebrow or a pause could get a laugh without a single word. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Carson's influence was unmatched. If he joked about a movie, book, or public figure, people paid attention. A good appearance on his show could launch a career overnight. A bad one could stall it. Comedians waited years for the chance to sit on his couch, knowing one strong performance could change their lives. Carson also controlled his show carefully. He decided who was welcome, who returned, and who disappeared. He avoided controversy on camera, but exercised enormous power behind the scenes. By the 1970s, he was the most powerful man in entertainment, even though he rarely talked about that power. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. And as his fame reached its peak, the cost of holding that much control began to show. Pattern of marriages. Johnny Carson was married 4 times, and each marriage followed a similar emotional pattern. As his fame and power grew, his ability to stay emotionally present shrank. To people who only knew him from television, Carson seemed charming, calm, and in control. To the women closest to him, he was often distant, guarded, and hard to reach. His first marriage was to Joan Walcott, long before fame entered his life. They married in 1949, when Carson was still struggling to build a career. At that stage, he was ambitious and focused, spending long hours working and thinking about what came next. As opportunities slowly appeared, pressure increased. Carson's attention was fixed on success, not stability. The marriage suffered from emotional distance and infidelity, and by the time his career began to take off, the relationship was already broken. They divorced in 1963, just as Carson was becoming a national figure. His second marriage to Joanne Copeland took place during the most intense period of his rise. Carson was now hosting The Tonight Show, and his life was consumed by work. The schedule was brutal, the pressure constant, and his public image carefully managed. This marriage was marked by emotional highs and lows. Arguments were frequent, and trust was fragile. Carson struggled to separate his public role from his private life. At home, he often shut down instead of communicating. Friends later described the relationship as unstable and tense, reflecting the strain of his growing fame. By the time Carson married Joanna Holland in the early 1970s, he was wealthy, famous, and deeply guarded. This phase of his life was filled with celebrity events, expensive homes, and elite social circles. From the outside, it looked glamorous. Inside the marriage, Carson continued to pull away emotionally. He enjoyed socializing, but only on his own terms. When the attention faded or expectations grew, he retreated. Silence became his default response to conflict. This marriage, like the others, ended in divorce. Carson's final marriage to Alexis Moss was very different in tone. They married in 1987 when Carson was older and beginning to step away from television. Moss was younger, quiet, and uninterested in Hollywood attention. This marriage was calmer and lasted until Carson's death. They lived largely away from the spotlight, especially after their retirement. While Carson still remained emotionally reserved, the relationship worked because it required less from him. There were fewer public expectations and less pressure to perform socially. Across all 4 marriages, a clear pattern emerges. As Carson became more successful, he became more withdrawn. He valued control and privacy above emotional openness. He preferred activities that allowed solitude, such as sailing, playing tennis, or sitting alone in silence. These moments gave him peace, but they also created distance from the people closest to him. Many friends noticed this contradiction in Carson's personality. He could be warm, funny, and generous with strangers. He made guests feel comfortable and valued. Yet with family, he often kept emotional walls in place. Conversations stayed surface level. Deep emotional exchanges made him uncomfortable. This wasn't cruelty, it was a habit formed over decades. Performance was where he felt safe. Intimacy was not. Carson's marriages reveal a man who struggled to balance connection with control. Love existed, but it competed with his need for distance. As his fame grew, so did the space he placed between himself and others, even those he cared about most. And one marriage, in particular, would soon collapse in a way that left scars Carson never fully recovered from. The affair that nearly destroyed him. During Johnny Carson's marriage to Joanne Copeland, one story followed him for decades because of how explosive and personal it was. The claim is that Joanne had an affair with Frank Gifford, the famous NFL star and TV personality. This story became widely known years later through accounts from people close to Carson, including his former lawyer, Henry Bushkin, who wrote that Carson believed the affair was real and acted on that belief. It's important to say this clearly. Joanne Copeland publicly denied that an affair happened, saying she and Gifford were just friends and that Carson was jealous. Reports at the time noted that others connected to the story also disputed it. So, whether the affair happened exactly as claimed is debated. But what is not debated is this: Carson believed he was being betrayed, and the emotional damage from that belief was intense. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Carson was already under constant pressure. He was hosting The Tonight Show, leading in ratings, and carrying the weight of being the face of late-night TV. His public image depended on control, calmness, sharpness, and being unshaken. He was careful about dignity, and he hated being embarrassed. That is why the idea of an affair hit him so hard. It wasn't just a marriage problem. To him, it felt like public humiliation, even if much of it happened behind closed doors. Accounts tied to Bushkin's memoir describe Carson reacting with rage and desperation, including confronting the situation in a dramatic way because he felt he needed proof. Even reading these stories years later, the main point is clear. Carson did not respond like someone who felt safe or supported. He responded like someone whose world was collapsing. After this period, people around Carson noticed changes. He became colder and more suspicious. He was already private by nature, but now privacy hardened into emotional distance. Friends and coworkers saw a man who could still perform perfectly on camera, yet seemed more guarded off camera. The situation also fed into another problem: drinking. Multiple accounts of his personal life describe alcohol becoming a bigger part of how he dealt with stress and anger over time. For Carson, trust was never easy. Fame made it harder because so many people wanted something from him: attention, money, access, or career help. When he believed his own wife had been unfaithful, it confirmed his worst fears, that even the closest people could hurt him. From that point on, he kept more of himself locked away. The friendly host was real on television, but the private man became harder to reach. This episode mattered because it didn't just end a marriage, it helped shape the version of Carson that came later, more controlled, less forgiving, and more alone than most viewers ever realized. And next, we'll get into how his drinking kept getting worse as the pressure and loneliness piled up. Drinking problems. By the time Johnny Carson was firmly established as the face of late-night television on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, another pattern was forming away from the cameras. Friends, co-workers, and guests would later describe how his drinking slowly became a serious part of his private life. What started in the 1960s as social drinking grew heavier in the 1970s, especially as pressure, fame, and personal troubles increased. Carson's job demanded perfection every night. He had to be quick, calm, and funny in front of millions of viewers. There was no room for mistakes. That level of pressure built up over time. Alcohol became a way for him to relax after the show, to quiet his thoughts, and to deal with feelings he rarely talked about. He did not openly discuss stress or emotional pain. Instead, he handled it quietly, and drinking became part of that routine. People who worked on the show noticed changes in his mood depending on whether he had been drinking. On some days, he was friendly and playful. On others, he was distant, sharp, or unusually quiet. Staff members learned to read the signs. Guests sometimes sensed it too, especially those who visited backstage before the show. Carson never let it fully show once the cameras were on, but off-camera, the difference could be clear. This contrast became one of the most striking parts of his personality. On television, Carson was steady and in control. His timing was perfect. His jokes landed. His interviews flowed naturally. Viewers saw a man who looked relaxed and confident. But after the show, that version of Carson often faded. The quiet, guarded side of him took over, and alcohol was frequently present during those hours. Drinking also tied into his growing sense of loneliness. As his marriages struggled and his trust in people weakened, Carson spent more time alone. He didn't like large social gatherings unless they were connected to work. He preferred smaller, quieter settings where he could avoid emotional conversations. Alcohol made those quiet nights easier for him. It filled space without requiring him to open up. Over time, Carson began to retreat more often to his home in Malibu, away from Hollywood and the noise of the industry. The ocean, the privacy, and the distance gave him comfort. He spent days sailing, playing tennis, or sitting in silence. These activities helped him feel calm, but they also reduced the number of close connections in his life. The more he withdrew, the more drinking fit into his routine without interruption. People close to him later said that Carson was not a constant drinker during work hours. He protected his performance carefully, but once work ended, the pattern returned. It became part of how he handled the weight of his life: success, betrayal, expectations, and the constant need to be on for the public. This private struggle did not ruin his career, but it shaped the man behind the desk. It deepened his emotional distance and made it harder for others to reach him. The audience never saw this side. They saw the polished host who seemed to have everything under control. And soon, a betrayal from someone he trusted on the show would test that control in a very public way. The Joan Rivers feud. For years, Joan Rivers was one of the most familiar faces on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. She appeared on the show more than any other guest comedian and quickly became a favorite with audiences. Her sharp humor, fast delivery, and fearless jokes made her stand out. More importantly, she earned the trust of Johnny Carson, something he did not give easily. Carson didn't just see Rivers as a guest, he saw her as a protege. He helped her career by giving her frequent airtime when other comics struggled to get noticed. When Carson was absent, Rivers often filled in as guest host, a role that came with prestige and pressure. At the time, that position was widely seen as a sign of approval. Many believed Rivers was being quietly prepared as a possible long-term successor, or at least as a trusted extension of Carson's brand. Behind the scenes, Carson treated Rivers with warmth and encouragement. He laughed at her jokes, defended her against critics, and supported her success. For a man who kept most people at a distance, this mattered. Rivers later said she felt deeply connected to Carson, not just professionally, but personally. She believed they had an understanding built on loyalty and honesty. That belief shattered in 1986. That year, Rivers accepted an offer to host her own late-night talk show on the Fox Broadcasting Company. From a business point of view, it was a major opportunity. Fox was a growing network, and Rivers would have her own show instead of waiting for chances to fill in. But there was one major problem. She accepted the offer without telling Carson first. When Carson found out, he was furious. What hurt him most was not competition or ratings. Carson did not feel threatened by Rivers' talent or by Fox. What upset him was the lack of communication. He believed Rivers owed him a private conversation before making such a move. In his mind, it was a personal betrayal. He felt blindsided by someone he had supported and trusted for years. Carson reacted the way he often did when he felt betrayed. He shut the door completely. Rivers was banned from The Tonight Show for life. There was no public argument, no dramatic confrontation on television. Carson simply cut her off. He never invited her back, never spoke her name on the show, and never addressed the situation directly with her. For Rivers, the silence was devastating. She tried to explain that network negotiations moved quickly and that she felt pressured to accept the deal. She later said she wanted to talk to Carson, but never got the chance. The break was sudden and final. One day, she was a regular presence on the most important show on television. The next day, she was erased from it. The Fox show itself struggled. Ratings were uneven, and internal problems weakened its future. Without Carson's support, Rivers lost a powerful platform that had helped shape her career. Years later, she openly called the fallout with Carson the most painful break of her professional life. She said she felt abandoned and deeply hurt by his refusal to speak with her. Carson, on the other hand, never publicly softened his stance. Friends said he believed loyalty mattered more than explanations. Once he felt crossed, he rarely reconsidered. This pattern had appeared before in his personal life, and now it played out in a very public way. The feud became one of the most famous silent breakups in entertainment history. No shouting, no lawsuits between them, just distance and silence. It showed how deeply Carson valued control and how unforgiving he could be when that control was challenged. And as Carson's world grew quieter, his final years would move even further away from the spotlight. The final years. When Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson in 1992, he did it the same way he handled much of his life, quietly and on his own terms. After 30 years on the air, he delivered a final episode that was respectful and emotional, but restrained. There was no extended farewell tour, no long press run, and no attempt to stay in the public eye. Once the show ended, Carson stepped away completely. For many fans, his disappearance was surprising. Carson had been a nightly presence in American homes for decades. He helped people end their day, shaped public conversations, and introduced generations of comedians and celebrities. Yet, once he retired, he showed no interest in holding on to that attention. He did not appear regularly on talk shows. He did not write memoirs or take part in television specials about his career. He simply walked away. In retirement, Carson lived mostly in Malibu, California, far from studio lights and audience applause. He spent his time sailing, playing tennis, and enjoying long stretches of silence. Friends said he valued privacy more than ever. He avoided Hollywood events and rarely returned phone calls. For someone who had mastered conversation on camera, he preferred not to speak publicly at all. Health issues also became more serious during these years. Carson had been a heavy smoker for much of his life, and the effects caught up with him. He was diagnosed with emphysema, a chronic lung disease that made breathing difficult. As time went on, the condition limited his activity. He became more fragile and increasingly careful about how he spent his energy. His world grew smaller and his circle tighter. Despite his declining health, Carson remained mentally sharp. He followed current events quietly and kept in touch with a small number of trusted friends. He occasionally sent handwritten notes to comedians he admired, offering encouragement without seeking attention. These small gestures reflected the part of him that still cared deeply about comedy, even though he no longer wanted to be seen. Carson's marriage to Alexis Moss continued quietly during these years. The relationship worked largely because it respected his need for space and privacy. They lived away from noise and expectations, and Carson seemed content with that arrangement. He did not chase excitement or reinvention. He appeared satisfied being out of view. On January 23, 2005, Johnny Carson died at the age of 79 from complications related to emphysema. His death took place in Malibu, the same place where he had chosen to live in near isolation. News of his passing spread quickly, and tributes poured in from around the world. Yet, even in death, Carson remained distant. There was no public funeral, and his family honored his wish for privacy. Carson's final years reflected the man he had become. He gave the world decades of laughter, then stepped away without looking back. He did not ask to be remembered loudly. He simply left. And even after his death, the way he handled his fortune revealed just how carefully he guarded his private life. The fortune few expected. When Johnny Carson died in 2005, people already knew he was rich. He had been the top man on late-night TV for decades, and he negotiated contracts that were famous in the industry. But what surprised many people wasn't just the size of his fortune, it was how quietly and carefully he arranged it. Most reports describe Carson's estate as being in the neighborhood of $300 million, an estimate since private estates often aren't fully public. What is clearly documented is that a huge part of his money was set up to move through a private plan, not through showy public announcements. Carson didn't want attention for his giving, and he didn't want drama around his will. The biggest headline came years after his death, when filings showed that Carson had made an enormous posthumous gift to the charitable foundation he created. In 1981, he started the John W. Carson Foundation, often called the Johnny Carson Foundation, to support causes like children's programs, education, and health services. Then, after he died, the foundation received a $156 million bequest from a trust connected to his estate, a number that stunned a lot of people because Carson had kept his giving so private while he was alive. So where did the rest go? A significant inheritance went to his fourth wife, Alexis Moss, who had been with him through his retirement years and remained out of the spotlight. Multiple summaries of his estate reporting say the money not directed to charity, and the foundation went mainly to Moss and his immediate family. Carson also had children, 3 sons from his first marriage, though one son died in 1991. Public accounts commonly note that his surviving sons received inheritance too. But the overall picture presented is that Carson's biggest financial statement was his charitable giving, not a flashy family payout. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories like this.